Well, welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. Well, it's no secret that there is a hard move in this country toward Marxist ideology in our schools, in our legal system, in race relationships, and even in economics. Today, we're going to be tackling this issue head on by discussing the American system of individual rights, limited government, and free markets. Our topic today is all things capitalism. Well, most people don't even have a basic idea about what true capitalism is. Today, we have a tremendous guest who's an expert on capitalism. His name is Mike Williams. Mike is the founder and president of ALTIUS Financial, a registered investment advisor. He brings over 30 years' experience in financial planning and wealth management, and he's earned numerous client service and investment advisory awards. Mike also created the Defenders of Capitalism Project, originally created to be a crucial component of the leadership program of the Rockies curriculum. He's also the host of the podcast Capital Idea, which expounds on freedom, capitalism, and the American ideals. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jimmy. I really appreciate it.
You bet. I'm excited for this segment because I've gotten to know you over the last 9 months as part of the LPR class of 2023, Building an Army of Freedom, and where we're going back to the timeless principles of freedom that form the foundation of America. And I got to tell you, I've learned so much, and really I've learned and grown in my understanding of and appreciation for kind of the American way, if you will, and in particular capitalism. You've been a big part of the LPR story. Tell us a little bit about your involvement.
Well, that is a long story. I've got to do a disclaimer first, Jimmy. You introduced me as a registered investment advisor, and I appreciate you mentioning that. But because of our regulatory state, we got to make sure we keep those hats separate. And I'm not giving any financial advice today. That nothing I say should be construed as investment or advice. But my background is in what I would call almost applied capitalism, helping people reach their financial goals. My history with the leadership program it's interesting because I started with maybe 15 minutes on one class day, close to 15 or maybe 16 years ago in the program. They were requiring people to read Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged, but not having any kind of structure around it. And so the president of the leadership program, Shari, asked me to put together some initial, just kind of presentations to give structure around reading Atlas Shrugged and understanding it better. So that was my initial involvement, and that has evolved over the last 15 years or so to be a much bigger part of the program. It's a full thread, so to speak, throughout the whole class.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'll tell you, you've stretched my understanding of capitalism. We'll talk a little bit about that. And the great news about it was in this class, you kind of create an environment where not everyone has to agree, not everyone has to see it the same way, but at the same time, we're challenging these ideas and ideals. And what I've really valued the most is when we challenge them and you can explain in a broader context about what you mean.
Yeah, I really appreciate you mentioning that. That's one of the key components that people don't really necessarily know about when they come into LPR, but Shari has created, the whole team has created a environment that is just that. We have certain principles we're advocating for, but the application of those principles in a political context or a social context are complex, and there's different views. And so we encourage that kind of a safe space and in a sense of just saying, hey, look, you're here to learn, and we're here to learn from you, and let's work through these things together. And sometimes we're going to disagree, and it's okay to do that.
Yeah, that's right. So let's get into it, because I know our audience is they have their own impressions about what capitalism is. There's been a tremendous marketing job, kind of an anti-capitalistic marketing job and propaganda, I believe, in America. So it becomes difficult to really support and believe in capitalism because of the negativity that's surrounded it for so long. You have a very succinct definition of what capitalism is. Share that with us.
So it's interesting they bring that up, because I think you're right that there's a lot of people who don't understand capitalism very well or understand it by its essentials. And it is crucial when you're talking about these kind of concepts to understand, have a clear really clear definition of what you mean by things. So if you just start off with the whole idea of capitalism, it's a socio-economic political system. That's one piece of it that basically recognizes and protects individual rights, including property rights, crucially property rights. And it's a system where all property is privately owned. So it's that social system, that socio-economic political system where people have their individual rights being recognized and protected by their government, and where all property is privately owned. And obviously we don't have that right now. We don't have pure private property. And that's, people sometimes think, well, that's not what I heard about capitalism. I thought capitalism was about business and trading and profits and all kinds of other, competition, all kinds of other words that we associate with capitalism that are part of it, but not the essential part of it. That essential part is rights protection.
It's amazing. I mean, that to me was an aha moment, right? Because I never associated capitalism truly with the exercise of individual rights, the protection of individual rights. I never even connected it, honestly, to our founding documents, our founding principles. I thought capitalism was just a system that we chose or that may have worked for us. But in reality, it is inextricably linked to America, to our system. And let's talk a little bit about the key components of it. One of the things that you spoke on early on is that this is about mutual voluntary exchange, freedom, not force. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, and I want to actually add on to what you said, Jimmy. I think you're right. It's essentially a system of America in terms of formally kind of creating a structure around it. But in one sense, I mean, this is the interesting thing about it, is that people have forever, since humanity began, have tried to build and create things in a self-interested, profit-seeking way. And it's not like people just started trading values or trading things when America was born. People would buy and sell things before America was born. So it's like, well, wait, what's different? Well, the difference is that it's setting up that system in a formal way that recognizes both the human nature, the fact that people want to do that. People want to actually live their lives for themselves, and they want to seek profit, and they want to trade with each other. And then setting up a system, well, yeah, you can do that voluntarily, where you're removing force from, trying as best you can to remove force from human relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's the thing, right, is whenever there is force, and boy, we've seen a lot of force exercised in America in the last 3 years. And, obviously we've had the situation with a global pandemic. I would argue that maybe that's not quite an accurate statement, but we certainly were under the heavy hand of force, of coercion from governmental forces. I mean, we saw things like, and, I don't know how far we want to get into this, but we saw things where our government was sitting in a position where they could actually shut down businesses, close their doors for extended periods of time. That seems to fly in the face of what we're talking about with capitalism, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. I think it's a little more complicated than a lot of people realize. I actually believe, and this may surprise you, Jimmy, but I actually believe that it's possible to have a pandemic situation where the government is acting within its proper role by shutting things down. At least I can imagine that. Now, this case of COVID was not appropriate to do that because it wasn't that big a threat. I mean, the key thing, right, the key role for government is to protect rights, protect individual rights and property rights. And that means if there is such a grave threat, where someone has a communicable disease where they really are, just by being in proximity to other people, they're threatening their rights, then the government does have a role. There was some confusion at the beginning, and maybe not so much confusion, maybe even intent. I don't know enough about really the epidemiology of it. I have, like you, some concerns about what happened in terms of the government taking that role. But in hindsight, they had absolutely no role. They were acting, most governments around the world, and including our own, was acting improperly in terms of the actual threat to to
Yeah.
individual rights.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that was most concerning about that was that the bureaucracy was largely responsible for these mandates, for these lockdowns, that it was local public health officials who are not elected oftentimes and who are operating, I think, in many times outside of their power. We think about limited government and why limited government is so important for capitalism and for human flourishing. Why is capitalism congruent with human nature? Why do those two things fit so well together?
Well, I mean, I touched on it a little bit. People are self-interested. The first thing that someone wants is survival, and then beyond that, they want to survive well. So I call it survive and thrive. People want to exist and they want to thrive, and that's self-interested. That means that they are interested in themselves first. If you could call it an instinct, that's what it would be. I have questions about whether human beings really have any instinct, because they don't have automatic knowledge with regard to how to behave, how to actually do that. They have to learn those things, right? They have to learn about survival and thriving. What's the best way to live? How do I live and live well? But that's the key component is people are self-interested, and capitalism is a system that allows for the freedom to use your own mind, to use your own body, to act upon that motivation of self-interest to better yourself. Capitalism, by protecting rights, by recognizing your right as an individual to live for your own sake, it's basically allowing you to say, okay, you have the freedom. We have a system now that allows you that kind of freedom to be able to live for your own sake and trade with others, and to better yourself by trading with others.
Right. And it's interesting, too, because you actually brought up a concept which I at first was so vehemently opposed to, where you said that I'm going to quote you, maybe this is a little mischaracterization, but you said essentially that selfishness is good. And I'm going to address that a little bit with the Wall Street quote from Gordon Gekko in a little bit. But you said essentially that selfishness or being self-interested is not necessarily a bad thing. And capitalism works together for the benefit of all, right? It elevates everybody. Tell us a little bit about your take on that.
Well, so there's a couple of concepts in there. One is, capitalism working by having a system set up that allows for people to be self-interested, to actually look out for themselves first, and encourage them to use their freedom, their mind, their body to better themselves. I mean, that was originally sort of recognized by Adam Smith, who's considered to be the father of economics, the father of the modern study of economics as a science. And he used this concept, this kind of mystical concept called the invisible hand. When each one of us are just looking out for each other, or not looking out for each other, but looking out for our individual self-interest, but trading with each other and having a system that protects, the violation of someone else's rights. But a system that is like that, it sort of mystically works out for everybody else. I mean, he made that observation in his book, The Wealth of Nations, observing, how nations traded with each other and how individuals and companies within those nations would better themselves. He made the observation, well, look, it looks like when people are able to do that, everyone else does better too. But he didn't, he didn't consider himself an economist. I mean, they didn't really have that term economist in that sense. He considered himself a moral theorist. And he didn't necessarily like his observation. Wait, selfishness works? But he was saying, just being reality focused and saying, hey, when you have a system that allows for people to be, long-term selfish, look out for their own ends and try to profit, then look, and it ends up working out for everybody else. That whole idea of selfishness, I mean, selfishness as a virtue. I mean, we touched on the fact that we, in the class, we read Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand is the author of that book, and she's also the author of a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. And her idea was to expand upon other philosophers who made the whole point of what's called ethical egoism, which is basically just the idea that no, it's ethical to look out for yourself. That doesn't mean it's ethical to violate other people. And that's oftentimes what people think. They think it's an either or. Either you're being selfish and violating other people's rights, hurting other people to get what you need, or you're being sacrificed yourself. And she rejected that dichotomy that, there's a third option. The third option is no. If you're really thinking about your self-interest, your long-term self-interest, you also will recognize there are other people you want to trade with. There are other people out there that you want to, but other people are a tremendous value in your life. But you don't have to choose to trade with them. You have the freedom to say, okay, I want, freedom of association. And that goes back to the founders in terms of them recognizing, no, you don't have to associate with everyone in your community. You can say, no, you go do your own thing and I'll do my own thing. We'll be free together. We won't violate each other's rights, and we can maybe decide to trade another day.
Right. And you know what I like about that too is that my long-term success really depends upon me bringing value to others, right? So you can't take advantage of people for very long without it having negative repercussions for yourself. So if I'm providing goods and services that don't have a value to others, that are cheap, and in that exchange, people start to realize that, hey, this product isn't very good, they're going to take their business elsewhere. So my selfish interest actually is to produce the best product at the best value so that people want it. And in so doing, the customer gets tremendous value. I get value, and you talked about that being a win-win. Capitalism is always about win-win, and that's what I love about it. The market eventually corrects for people who are unethical. Another thing that I love about capitalism is the incentive side of it, right? This incentivized idea that you can, if you innovate, if you're creative, you talk about the greatest wealth is in the human mind, right? Your ability to innovate leads to prosperity and profit. I love the fact that capitalism has built-in incentives to provide things of value and do the right things. Talk a little bit about that cooperation, that competition, and the idea of incentives.
Well, in one sense, I would say it's not just capitalism; it's the world we live in. It's reality that has incentives. The fundamental choice in life is either you live or you die, right? And so life itself has incentives. Life, just being alive, doesn't actually keep you alive. You have to figure out, okay, what do I need to do? So there's the incentives to try to figure things out, to use your mind, to be able to say, okay, how do I survive, and how do I survive in a better way than I have in the past? And that's where you get into that whole idea of in terms of innovations, people doing something different. If you keep doing the same things, you're going to get the same results. And if you think back to the sort of caveman existence or prehistoric existence, if there wasn't anybody who's saying, wait, there's this thing that I'm afraid of it, but it's fire, and we can use it to cook or keep ourselves warm, and innovate in that way, or the guy, whoever the genius was who created the wheel, right? I mean, that was something different. Everyone was like, yeah, let's beat him over the head because he's talking crazy. He's trying to shape a rock into a wheel, and that's upsetting the gods or something. He was thinking differently than other people. And that's the whole process of humanity just wanting to improve, each individual trying to improve themselves. Capitalism is the structure that allows for those incentives to work in a rational way for the benefit of people by protecting each individual in their own person and property.
That's great. And one of the things that you asked on our final exam, if you will, our Defense of Capitalism final exam is America a capitalist system? Tell us if we are, because there's a huge misperception about this, right? Are we a capitalist system?
We're definitely not a capitalist system today. And the thing is, capitalism is an ideal. When you initially asked me to define it, if you said, and I emphasize this whenever I talk to people, all property is privately held. All property. Well, we definitely don't have that. There's plenty of property. I mean, the majority of the land mass in the U.S. is owned by the federal government or the state governments. So just in that fact alone, we don't have that being private property. Just when you think about your own home or the things that you pay taxes on or have to ask permission for, even your business, in one sense, you don't have full control over it because the government is exercising its force by either laws, regulations, mandates, permissions, licensing, all kinds of things where they're saying, well, it's your property if you follow these rules. So you don't have full, you don't have full property rights in America. Now, that doesn't mean we're a communist system either. We're not a fully socialist system. We're a mixed economy. We're basically a mixture of the state and its interventions in our lives, and some freedoms depending upon which area that we talk about. We still have lots of freedoms, but we're certainly not a capitalist system today. And my case would be that every time, and you may say, a person may say, well, when you define it that way, Mike, there's no such thing as capitalism. We've never had it. And that's true in one sense. But if you look at history and you say, well, okay, you have this ideal of all property being privately held and the protection of rights in that sense versus the state and the state owning everything, or purely a collectivist system, those two extremes are in a sense ideals. Whenever you've moved more toward this ideal of fully private property and the protection of rights, you've had an incredible flourishing of human beings in all aspects, whether it's material, spiritual, however you might define it. Every single way you can measure the good for a human being, as a human being, people have thrived. So, I mean, that's the way I would explain it, is people need to realize that every time we move toward that ideal, we get better off.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm reminded all the time that I don't technically own my property. We just went through here in Larimer County in Colorado. We just went through a property assessment reevaluation. And it just reminds you that your ownership of your property is conditional. It's conditional upon you paying taxes to the state or to the county in this particular case in order to maintain your property. And there is this piece. There is this piece when that happens, when you realize the amount of taxes that are attached to your property, and then the taxes that you pay on everywhere. We'll talk a little bit more about that. It's part of the reason why individual property rights are so important, because in some ways it keeps the government limited in their scope of what they can do to you. If you don't own your property, then they can take your property at any point. You said early on in the curriculum that America is the only nation born of a moral idea. This idea that there is a moralistic component to America. What do we mean by that?
Well, it means a number of things. If you look at history, most nations were born out of some kind of conquest, or they were born out of someone. Maybe it was a king or someone who thought they were going to be the emperor, or somebody or a military general who was saying, we're going to now take over this area, this geographic area, and we're going to call it ours, and we're going to call it our nation, and I'm the one who's going to be in control. So most nations were born out of conquest and power that way, versus our founding, where we were part of England and we were part of that empire. But we said, wait, this isn't working out for us as a people here. And we're going to consciously, first of all, study a little bit about history and how people got along. What were the best systems of government? What were the best ways that worked for people? And declared our independence in a moral way of saying, no, we're going to set up a system that's different than what has ever existed before. And it's going to be based on the recognition of each individual having a right to their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, including property. I mean, that statement itself, it's really encapsulated in the one state, the introduction to the Declaration of Independence, of declaring why, saying we're going to form our own country, not because we're taking over some new land. Now, people might, historically, you could talk about, okay, well, North America, the indigenous people here and so forth. But the 13 colonies were basically saying, we're here and we're not going to be part of England anymore. We're declaring our independence based upon this moral precept of each individual having their own right to their life. And that's what we mean by it being born of a moral ideal.
Yeah. And you know what I love about that concept too is we basically flipped the script on government's role, right? Before this, government kind of grants its citizens rights. And what we said was, no, those rights actually are unalienable. They come from God. They come from the Creator. They can't be taken away. And the role of government isn't to grant us those rights. Instead, it's to protect those individual rights, those rights to property, those rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I just love the fact that we are I shouldn't say it this way because people take it wrong, but we're an upside down nation. We say that there's something greater than government. And I love the fact that our government's role, and if for me, one of the biggest things I took from the class was government's role in its limited scope is to protect my rights. And what I see now, seeing it through that lens now, makes me see all of the ways that government is infringing upon my rights, chipping away at all my constitutionally protected rights. You've got to be seeing that on scale now, especially in this area.
Absolutely. Although I think one of the things that's amazing to me is that a lot of people, and especially people who I'm more sympathetic with, maybe on the right side of the political spectrum, conservatives or people who are more pro-America, so to speak, it feels like they're just kind of waking up to this themselves right now, and that it's been going on for a long time. The seeds of cultural change are oftentimes planted decades ago, or even maybe longer than that. I mean, if you think about what's, all these violations of rights that you're speaking of, Jimmy, those didn't just happen overnight. I mean, there was more of a philosophical, moral seeds that were planted during the progressive era, really 100 years ago, that did change the nature of how our government works, the relationship between the individuals in America and their government, and the individual citizens' understanding of the role of government. That whole idea of, a government its job, its proper role is to protect rights, is a crucial concept in America, and it wasn't just born in America. I mean, obviously, the founders were relying on monumental thinkers like John Locke and people before him. The whole Enlightenment tradition coming out of Europe, especially the Scottish Enlightenment, not the French version. That whole tradition is what the founders in America were relying upon to justify and building upon to be able to say, no, this is the proper role of government to protect rights. Now, the problem is that rights itself, that concept of rights themselves, have to be better understood, because in today's world, if you say rights, well, people might agree with you and say, yeah, our government is to protect our rights, our right to healthcare, our right to a dignified retirement, or a right to be educated. And that's not what a capitalist means as rights. You can't have rights to other people's things. You can't have a right to violate someone else. And whenever you have a right to something, some physical thing, some physical good or service, then you're going to end up saying, okay, you have a conflict of rights, versus the correct version that the founders recognize is the right to action, the be able to pursue. That's why they use that term, to pursue your happiness. You don't have a right to happiness, and you don't have a right to healthcare. You have a right to pursue those things. You have the right to earn them. You have the freedom to be able to earn these things. But that's oftentimes a confusion in that whole discussion about rights. And that's something that people need to be more clear on.
Well, I think that's really important, because the right, one person's right can't require taking from another in order for you to establish that right. There has to be the opportunity, right? We talk a lot about having equal opportunity and not equity per se, where you kind of redistribute the wealth. But this is interesting. You mentioned the seeds of cultural change are oftentimes planted generations ago. And boy, that is so true. I think what we're seeing is the fruit of those seeds that were planted decades and decades ago. In that context, why do so many people today, especially young people, have a favorable idea of socialism? Like, why is this? It feels like it's all of a sudden, but it's not all of a sudden. But why are they so leaning in to this idea of socialism?
Well, I think you're exactly right that's happening, and I think I would say that especially young people are empathetic because of those seeds that were planted, as we talked about. Our whole government monopoly on education has sort of engendered that, in some ways purposefully, maybe in some ways not so purposefully, but it's definitely encouraged a collectivist mindset. And today, our government schools are not educational institutions; they're indoctrination institutions. They're basically indoctrination for not socialism per se, or even Marxism per se, but collectivism in the sense of the primary objective is to make you fit into the social structure. That's what our objective is, to educate you, so you fit into the social structure, versus many other alternative objectives of what an educational system could have. Part of it's because that they've been indoctrinated. So young people have grown up with this idea of not explicit so much. Again, it's becoming more and more explicit. I think you mentioned the whole, the teachers union and some of they're becoming more explicit, which is a good thing. And I guess we'll maybe talk about that. But that's one piece, is they've been indoctrinated that way. But another point is that young people are typically more idealistic. Once you get a few years under your belt, you get a little skepticism, and you get kind of, unless you really are conscious about being actively engaged in the world, and you can do this as a 50-year-old or as a 70-year-old, but a lot of times you get kind of like, okay, here's the way the world works. Here's my own either explicit or oftentimes implicit philosophy about how the world works. And you get skeptical about things. Younger people are typically more open, and they're idealistic. They're like, well, I want the right, the moral, the good. I want I want to be idealistic about the world. I don't want to give up like these old people have on what's going on. And there's never been, I am an objectivist, someone who subscribes to Ayn Rand's philosophy. And she believes and said, and I agree with her, that there's never been an adequate, true moral defense as an ideal, as capitalism as an ideal. Most of the people who've defended capitalism, including all the way back to Adam Smith, were saying, hey, it does work. This invisible hand thing where people can be selfish and trade with each other, it works. It works out better for people, but it's not good. It's not really the moral thing. The moral thing is to sacrifice for each other and be more, my brother's keeper, so to speak. No one has ever made the case and saying, no, this whole idea of selfishness in a long-term rational way is itself a moral ideal. So people are on the right don't really appeal to young people because they're not idealistic. They're kind of a compromise. The people on the left who say, no, collectivism, I am my brother's keeper. We should all be this way. The utopia of a socialist society, that's the ideal. And so young people gravitate toward that idealism, even though it's false. They haven't heard an alternative. They haven't heard no, wait, there's an alternative that really is idealistic. And so that's a big piece of it. I think the last thing I would say about young people is there's oftentimes, especially given what I said about the indoctrination, a desire on the part of young people and maybe their parents to not have them grow up, to kind of protect them. And young people are not, they don't necessarily have the consequences of reality. They go through this, sort of social collectivist school system where it's mostly about, are you fitting in? Are you wearing the right pair of jeans, or did you, succeed on an athletic field? Yeah. But then you go into college, which is kind of like an extension of that, sort of a vacation, not really being engaged with the world. Today we have, safe spaces, and we don't want to have people think for themselves. We got to protect them from things that they don't agree with. So it's like this desire to delay growing up. And I think that's part of it as well.
Yeah. And I think, too, they probably have, like you alluded to, a kind of a fundamental misunderstanding of what socialism and capitalism actually are. It's funny because, there's some studies that have been out that show that when kids start working earlier, the earlier the better, the more they understand and link together hard work and rewards. They appreciate the value of hard work. They appreciate the value of 1 hour of work. I remember when my oldest son, he now lives in California. I remember when he got his first paycheck and he looked at the percentage of taxes that were taken out of his paycheck. He about lost it. He's like, wait a minute. This means, based on what they're taking out of my check, it means that I'm working for the government through April. And that's just on income taxes and payroll taxes and all this nonsense, not to mention the taxes on everything else. I think that gets young people's attention when they actually link how hard they're working and the value of what they're getting. But one of the things that you mentioned was, well, hey, thanks for joining us for part 1 in this 2-part series with Mike Williams in all things capitalism. Our first session has been dynamic, but you're going to want to make sure you listen to part 2 coming up.